Have you ever wondered what happens when the people entrusted with our lives become the architects of death? Tonight, we uncover the chilling stories of 8 nurses across America who betrayed their sacred oath, committing heinous crimes that led to life sentences or even death verdicts. Stay with us as we delve into these harrowing accounts. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss a single shocking detail. Charles Cullen. Charles Cullen arrived at Morristown Memorial Hospital in 1988, armed with a deceptively calm facade, a neatly pressed uniform, a polite smile, and a resume that masked a dark compulsion. Over the next 16 years, he would become one of the most notorious angel of death nurses in American history, responsible for injecting lethal doses of digoxin, insulin, and other medications into unsuspecting patients. His methods were chillingly simple: titrate a drop or two too many, leave no obvious signs, and watch as bodies went into sudden cardiac arrest. Hospital administrators strove to pin the mysterious cluster of codes and crashes on hospital machinery or natural causes, but whispers of foul play began to circulate. In New Jersey, a string of baffling patient downturns caught the wary attention of ECU staff. Yet, Charles Cullen was relentless, shifting from hospital to hospital as suspicion grew. He managed to charm colleagues and deflect inquiries, always presenting himself as the diligent, caring nurse. But by 2003, patterns of unusual medication usage and patient codes began to draw the scrutiny of state investigators. When law enforcement finally exhumed records and found that Cullen consistently administered excessive amounts of certain drugs, often right before patients flatlined, they knew they had a monster in their midst. The chilling tally of bodies trailing his career number at least 29 confirmed victims, though authorities believe the true count to be closer to 40 or more. Once arrested, Cullen initially denied wrongdoing, but soon confessed to dozens of homicides, claiming he got bored and was curing patients, a delusion that underscored his chilling absence of empathy. In court, families of the victims recounted how their loved ones had gone in for minor procedures and never wakened, their families robbed of closure, left only with unanswered questions. Prosecutors painted him as a vengeful, unrepentant killer who found twisted pleasure in playing God over vulnerably sick individuals. The emotional weight pressed heavily on survivors and colleagues. Imagine learning that a trusted caregiver was orchestrating death rather than delivering comfort. During his trial in New Jersey, Cullen pleaded guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder. He received 18 consecutive life sentences, with no possibility of parole until at least 2043, and additional life terms in Pennsylvania for the multiple deaths that occurred there. His victims ranged in age from infants to the elderly, each story layered with sorrow. An 80-year-old man who asked for a glass of water before dying, a child who slipped into an irreversible coma after an unexplained overdose, a nurse's aide who tried to resuscitate an attacker from within the hospital itself. Appeals and motions followed, but Cullen effectively waived most of his rights, choosing to remain behind bars for the rest of his days. As families spoke of shattered trust and nighttime whispers of what-if nightmares, the Cullen case forced hospitals nationwide to confront how easily protocols could be subverted by a single individual. Today, overlooking the pastoral hills of New Jersey, prison walls hold a man whose compassion was a mask that concealed a gruesome hunger to kill, one drop at a time. Kristen Heather Gilbert. When Kristen Gilbert walked into the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts, in the mid-1990s, she projected the aura of a caring, competent emergency department nurse. Yet behind her disarming smile lay a macabre obsession, an insatiable need for adrenaline jolts generated by medical crises. Over a 2-year stretch between 1995 and 1996, Gilbert secretly injected epinephrine into IV bags of unsuspecting veterans, sending their hearts into forced tachycardia. Within moments, alarms blared and code teams scrambled, all while Gilbert loitered just outside the crisis, as if drawn to watch the adrenaline-fueled frenzy she had engineered. The horror began to surface when staff noticed that emergency codes suspiciously spiked under her shifts, and some patients gambled with survival odds in bewildering ways. Veteran families confided that their loved ones had seemed stable, only to plummet inexplicably into life-threatening arrhythmias. The connection to Gilbert emerged after a scathing internal review discovered unusually high doses of epinephrine at Gilbert's station, coupled with vaulting cardiac events. When authorities interviewed her colleagues, a pattern of whispered suspicion and hushed dread colored their testimonies. Gilbert often hovered near monitors with an eerie calm, clutching her clipboard, her gaze flickering with unspoken anticipation. Federal investigators soon uncovered a trail of dead veterans, 4 confirmed victims whose hearts stopped at the precise moment someone had tampered with their IV lines. Gilbert was arrested in 1996 and indicted under federal murder charges, her trial held on the grounds that all crimes occurred on government property. As prosecutors detailed how Gilbert had watched through glass windows, expressionless, while medical teams fought valiantly to revive victims she had poisoned. Courtroom spectators felt a collective chill. Her defense lawyers argued she suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a need to catalyze medical emergencies to feel needed, but jurors saw only a calculating killer who preyed on the most vulnerable. Testimonies from survivors were harrowing. One veteran described ripping out his catheter in panic as his heart thundered, instincts kicking in just in time to save himself. Another nurse wept on the stand, recalling how she had begged Gilbert to help when her patient crashed, never imagining it was Gilbert who had induced the crash. Gilbert remained stoic, her gaze vacant, as the weight of the charges crashed down. Ultimately, Gilbert was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and 2 counts of attempted murder. The jury, unmoved by pleas for leniency, handed down 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 20 years for the attempted murders. Appeals would follow, claiming procedural errors, but each was swiftly dismissed. Behind the razor-wire fences of a federal penitentiary, Gilbert serves a term that ensures she will never walk free, in stark contrast to the families of her victims, who must forever wrestle with the knowledge that a trusted caregiver coldly manipulated the line between life and death for her own twisted gratification. Janine Ann Jones. In the quiet corridors of Bezar County's medical facilities during the early 1980s, a young licensed vocational nurse named Janine Ann Jones seemed to embody innocence. Soft-spoken, with a gentle bedside manner that comforted anxious parents of pediatric patients. But lurking beneath that tender smile was a chilling compulsion to induce crises in infants and toddlers under her watch. Jones administered digoxin, heparin, or the neuromuscular blocker succinylcholine to her tiny patients, triggering unexplained heart failure and respiratory arrest. Within days, the local hospital's neonatal unit recorded a series of baffling SIDS-like incidents and critical emergencies, yet neither doctors nor administrators could pinpoint the cause. Parents watched in horror as once thriving children spiraled into danger. A 15-month-old girl seizing uncontrollably, an 11-month-old boy slipping into a coma so quickly that nurses scrambled for adrenaline doses that never arrived in time. Each death was labeled accidental, but whispers grew. 6 children in 1 year was not mere coincidence. The pattern emerged when another child, Lucas McLennan, arrived with inexplicable high levels of digoxin. His terrified parents insisted on answers, and when prosecutors tested hospital records, they discovered that the medication drawer Jones accessed contained no missing pills. She had injected directly. Alarmed, officials launched a wide-ranging investigation, interviewing staff, exhuming bodies, and reconstructing medication logs. When confronted, Jones initially denied wrongdoing, offering tearful pleas of innocence. But the evidence was overwhelming. Toxicology reports matched the drugs found in her station to those in the children's systems, and witnesses recalled seeing her tamper with IV lines. Under mounting pressure, she finally confessed to injecting dozens of young patients over the course of a year, claiming, in a disquieting rationalization, that she was testing her instincts and searching for drama. Families of the victims learned that up to 60 children could have been targeted, though only 2 murders were ever proven. In her first trial, prosecutors focused on the merciless killing of 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan. The courtroom fell silent as jurors heard how Jones had intentionally administered a massive dose of digoxin, leaving small Chelsea gasping for air until irreversible damage occurred. Her sentencing felt like a reprieve to some, yet for many families, nothing could fill the void. Jones was handed a 99-year prison sentence under Texas law, effectively life without parole given credit for time served rules. She was 30 at the time. Decades later, enshrined behind the grim walls of Gatesville State Prison, Jones faced yet another indictment for the death of baby Joshua Sawyer, who had perished under eerily similar circumstances in 1980. In 2020, with her first sentence nearing the age at which she might have qualified for release, Jones pleaded guilty to Joshua's murder to cement her incarceration. A second life sentence was imposed, ensuring she will never feel the sun on her face again. Families of her young victims continue to wrestle with agonizing what-ifs, haunted by images of trust betrayed, of lullabies interrupted by gasps for air, and of a smiling nurse whose bedside manner concealed a deadly thirst for control over life and death. Richard Angelo. Richard Angelo's friendly demeanor masked a chilling darkness that emerged in the winter of 1987 at Good Samaritan Hospital in Troy, New York. As a newly minted registered nurse in his mid-20s, Angelo exuded confidence and competence in the intensive care unit, the kind of presence that puts families at ease as they watch their loved ones fight for life. Yet beneath his calm exterior lay a compulsion, the need to play God, to engineer medical crises so that he could savor the thrill of saving or punishing patients at his whim. It began with subtle manipulations of IV lines. A drop of air, a slight overage of insulin, or a quiet adjustment to the saline drip was enough to tip a fragile patient over the edge into cardiac or respiratory distress. Witnesses later described how Angelo seemed unconcerned when alarms blared, as if he expected these emergencies and relished their arrival. He would rush to the bedside, code sheet clutched in hand, orchestrating frantic resuscitation efforts he had secretly sabotaged. When patients stabilized under his careful hands, he absorbed the praise. When they died, he appeared crestfallen yet oddly unshaken. Nurses on other shifts noticed an unsettling pattern. Individuals under Angelo's care experienced unexplained crashes. An elderly man who arrived for minor surgery coded out of nowhere. A young woman recovering from a routine procedure spiraled into unanticipated hypoglycemia. A veteran languishing in a coma whose heart inexplicably stopped. At first, colleagues chalked it up to chance or natural disease progression, but whispers grew louder when Angelo was always nearby whenever alarms announced trouble. Troy police launched a covert investigation after a concerned nurse secretly logged unusual vital sign trends and asked auditors to cross-reference drug dispensation. slowly, a pattern emerged. Patients who died or nearly died had disproportionately low insulin levels or evidence of air bubbles in their lungs, hallmarks of foul play. Detectives intercepted Angelo's medication logs and discovered he had removed far more vials of insulin and syringes than the hospital could account for. Confronted with the evidence, Angelo's facade crumbled. He admitted to injecting multiple patients with air or lethal doses of insulin to trigger crises. In chilling detail, he described the rush he felt whenever someone choked or convulsed, an unnerving candidness that left investigators and jurors alike recoiling. Families of victims spoke of trust shattered, of grandmothers who went in for rest and never woke, of men whose wounds mysteriously refused to heal after a sudden bout of insulin-induced hypoglycemia. At his trial, prosecutors charged him with 2 counts of second-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree manslaughter, 1 count of criminally negligent homicide, and multiple counts of assault. The courtroom was thick with grief as relatives recounted the final moments. A daughter cradling her father as he gasped for breath, a wife clinging to her husband's hand as his IV line flooded his body with air. Angelo's attorneys argued mental illness, but expert testimony revealed no history of psychosis, only a perverse desire for attention. After less than a day of deliberations, a jury found Angelo guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 50 years to life in a maximum security prison, ensuring he would never again wear a nurse's scrubs. Angelos' case ripped away the comforting illusion that hospitals are safe havens, exposing how easily a single individual can commandeer life and death decisions. Families still grapple with the anguish of knowing that a trusted caregiver engineered their loved one's suffering, an outrage that lingers long after the verdict and jail doors slammed shut. Vicki Dawn Jackson. In the summer of 2001, Nocona General Hospital in northern Texas seemed like any other small-town medical center. Clean halls and friendly staff, and a community that relied on it for critical care. Vicki Dawn Jackson, a vivacious 37-year-old licensed vocational nurse, had worked there for years, earning praise for her compassion and upbeat personality. Patients and families felt comfort under her care, trusting her gentle bedside manner. But beneath that warmth, Jackson bore a lethal obsession, a growing fascination with the power to snuff out life quietly, easily, unseen. Over 6 months, emergency rooms and intensive care bays flooded with unexplainable codes. Elderly men who slammed into unanticipated respiratory failure, post-operative patients who seized under sedation, and individuals with no apparent risk factors whose oxygen levels plummeted. Every time, Jackson was on duty. Hospital leadership dismissed early warnings as coincidental, attributing each case to underlying ailments or hospital-acquired infections. After all, small hospitals in rural regions frequently see sicker patients sent from larger cities, and Nocona had just upgraded its intake of high-risk cases. But the number of fatalities under Jackson's watch would soon stir suspicion. In October 2001, a grieving family insisted on an autopsy after their father's heart simply stopped. Toxicology revealed mivacurium, a potent muscle relaxant that paralyzes the diaphragm, traces of which were nowhere prescribed. Another patient's blood tested positive for the same agent. Hospital administrators, now alarmed, asked forensic pathologists to re-examine other unexplained deaths. Suddenly, at least 10 patients, many near death but not yet terminal, had succumbed under eerily similar circumstances. Law enforcement moved swiftly. Police shadowed Jackson, monitored her every shift, and reviewed medication logs. Detectives noted that stored vials of mivacurium were frequently opened without accountability. They interviewed Jackson's co-workers. Some recalled seeing her loiter near drug cabinets late at night, her eyes distant, her vivacious smile replaced by a grim focus. Eventually, she was arrested and charged with capital murder. At her bond hearing, prosecutors described how Jackson injected unsuspecting patients to watch them writhe, then feigned heroism as she frantically called for codes. In court, tearful families testified, siblings recounting frantic 911 calls, parents describing how a seemingly minor procedure turned into a fight for life, only for Jackson to insist that their loved one's tragic decline was sudden and unforeseeable. Jackson's defense claimed mental anguish, but the jury saw cold calculation. She had tampered with IV lines, sometimes leaving minimal traces to suggest natural respiratory collapse. When the verdict came, Jackson was convicted on 10 counts of capital murder, each representing a life she extinguished. The judge sentenced her to life in prison, with no possibility of parole until at least 2042 under Texas law. For families, the sentence felt bittersweet. Nothing could restore their loved ones, robbed of moments in the sun, laughter, or final goodbyes. Behind razor-wire fences, Jackson's days continue under harsh lights, far removed from the cheery corridors where she once governed life and pulled the plug on hope. Heather Irene Presti. In mid-2020, Willowbrook Manor, a long-term care facility nestled in suburban Pennsylvania, prided itself on compassionate elder care. Heather Irene Presti, an affable registered nurse in her early 30s, fit right into that model. Known for her upbeat chatter and genuine concern for residents, she charmed families and colleagues alike. Yet, over the next 3 years, whispers began to swirl around the nursing stations. Sudden hypoglycemic episodes, diabetic residents crashing inexplicably, and whispers that Presti loitered suspiciously near the insulin carts during graveyard shifts. It started subtly. An 82-year-old man, stable on a predictable insulin regimen, plunged into a coma one frigid night in December 2020. Doctors scrambled, finding his blood sugar tied in knots far below expected levels. A week later, an 87-year-old woman collapsed during breakfast, convulsing on the dining room linoleum. No history of diabetes irregularity should have caused such a rapid plunge. Nurses initially chalked it up to charting errors, a miscalculated dose or pump failure. But within months, at least 7 elderly patients had experienced similar crises. Each time, Presti was found nearby, clipboard in hand, observing the chaos with an uncanny detachment. In early 2023, a veteran nurse covertly tracked insulin inventories and reconciled patient charts, finding that far more insulin was dispensed than could be accounted for by legitimate treatments. Hospital administrators then pieced together surveillance footage, late-night footage of Presti entering the medication room long after her shift ended, exiting with suspicious vials tucked into her pocket. Confronted with this evidence, Presti initially denied wrongdoing, insisting she was researching dosing errors. But police uncovered logs of phone searches on signs of insulin overdose and impact of low blood sugar on elderly. When investigators reviewed medical records, they counted at least 22 incidents where Presti's patients fell into critical hypoglycemia, 3 of whom died before paramedics could stabilize them. One case haunted the county coroner, a 90-year-old woman living with mild dementia whose last coherent words were to her granddaughter, "I'm so cold," before wrangling with Dora, the feeding tube. The coroner's report revealed a lethal cocktail of insulin far above the medical charted dose. Under mounting evidence, Presti was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 19 counts of attempted murder. In the ensuing trial, prosecutors described her actions as premeditated cruelty, selecting vulnerable seniors who relied on regimented care and manipulating their insulin to watch them slip toward death. Testimonies from surviving residents painted Presti as a smiling predator, quietly slipping vials from locked cabinets and altering charts to conceal her tracks. Presti's defense team argued mental instability, claiming she believed she was sparing patients from prolonged suffering. But jurors found no credible medical justification. Insulin overdoses are unmistakably traumatic, and her victim's final moments entailed terrifying tremors and gasps for air. After a week-long deliberation, Presti was convicted on all counts. The judge imposed 3 consecutive life sentences, one for each murder charge, plus an aggregated sentence of 380 to 760 years for attempted murder, ensuring her captivity would eclipse any hope of release. For families of the victims, children who rushed to nursing homes only to find their parents unresponsive, spouses who prayed to God for just one more sunrise, the verdict brought a fractured relief. The halls of Willowbrook remain haunted. Empty wheelchairs parked beneath fluorescent lights, medical charts still bearing the echoes of altered insulin orders, and the enduring mystery of trust betrayed by a nurse whose bedside manner concealed a horrifying hunger to snatch life from those she was sworn to protect. Kimberly Clark Sayans. Kimberly Clark Sayans arrived at the Texas Dialysis Center in late 2004 as a seemingly earnest, licensed practical nurse. Colleagues described her as soft-spoken yet deeply committed, often arriving early to prepare stations and staying late to comfort patients struggling through exhausting catabolic dialysis sessions. To her family, she was the doting daughter and devoted niece, always calling on holidays to ask after her grandparents. But beneath that veneer of devotion hid a perverse fascination with the frailty of life. In early 2005, a spate of troubling incidents began to surface. Once stable dialysis patients who suddenly spiked high fevers or plunged into unexpected septic shock. At first, these events were chalked up to minor complications, immunocompromised individuals who occasionally battled infections. But the frequency and eeriness of these cases soon caught the attention of local health authorities. It began with Mr. Abney, a 62-year-old retired truck driver whose failing kidneys had recently led him to the center 3 times a week. During a routine session, his vitals abruptly collapsed. He spiked a fever of 106 degrees Fahrenheit and went into septic shock. Nurses scrambled to save him, searching for the culprit. No clear source of infection, no contaminated water lines or mislabeled medication orders. When an autopsy revealed high levels of bleach, beyond trace contaminations, in his bloodstream, alarm bells sounded. Weeks later, similar crises befell 4 other patients, each discovering to their horror that their dialysis lines had been tainted with bleach, a potent toxin known to ravage red blood cells and nerve endings. Investigators infiltrated the center, reviewing surveillance footage and conducting unannounced audits of the medication and cleaning supplies. They noticed that on every disastrous shift, Sayans had a window of time when she entered supply closets unsupervised. A deeper dive into inventory logs revealed that Sayans had removed small bottles of bleach-based cleaning agents in quantities that made no sense for routine sanitation. Confronted with this data, she at first feigned ignorance, insisting she only grabbed supplies for MICU-level disinfection. But slowed surveillance footage captured her expertly melding bleach into saline bags, and the pipeline of evidence swelled. When police arrested her in mid-2005, Sayans offered a disturbing explanation. She claimed she wanted to increase her importance, believing that by triggering crises she could then heroically save patients and gain praise. Prosecutors showcased damning testimonies. One young technician recounted how Sayans smirked as she watched a hemodialysis machine alarm blare, as if mesmerized by the chaos. In court, relatives of victims sobbed while describing how their loved ones once stable on dialysis, had convulsed suddenly, their bodies overtaken by invisible forces of chemical corrosion. At trial, the jury heard of at least 5 confirmed deaths and 5 additional attempted murders, each tied to slivers of bleach smuggled into locked supply areas by a nurse they had trusted. Meticulously, prosecutors laid out how Sayans had exploited the trust bestowed upon her. She knew the standard operating procedures, the locked cabinets, and every vulnerability in patient monitoring. By selecting victims vulnerable because of compromised renal clearance and immune defenses, she wielded bleach as a silent executioner. After 3 agonizing days of testimony, the jury found Sayans guilty on 5 counts of capital murder and 3 counts of aggravated assault. The judge, confronted with evidence so grotesque it defied normal comprehension, sentenced her to life imprisonment plus 60 years, an effective life sentence without the possibility of parole. Incarcerated in a maximum security facility near Houston, Sayans remains a living cautionary tale, a caregiver who inverted the Hippocratic Oath, using her knowledge and access to snuff out life rather than preserve it. Families of her victims struggle daily with the knowledge that a woman they believed was their guardian became their executioner, weaving bleach into bags meant to sustain them rather than kill. William George Davis. William George Davis first arrived at Christus Trinity, Mother Frances Hospital in Tyler, Texas, in early 2017 as a veteran registered nurse with a reputation for competence. In whispered hallways, colleagues admired his steady hands and comforting bedside manner. Patient families trusted him implicitly, believing their loved ones were in capable hands. Davis was known to spearhead critical care initiatives, often rallying teams during code blues with calm authority. Yet a darker compulsion lurked behind his professional facade, the power to transform post-operative hope into irreversible tragedy with a single syringe. Over the summer of 2017, cardiothoracic patients at the hospital began experiencing inexplicable, acute air embolisms, painful, rare events where air enters the bloodstream, obstructing blood flow to vital organs and causing sudden strokes or cardiac arrest. One evening, a 56-year-old teacher, recovering smoothly from bypass surgery, seized violently, gasping for breath as paramedics struggled to clear her vessels. Another patient, a 48-year-old construction worker, abruptly lost consciousness mid-ward rounds. Doctors discovered ominous air bubbles blocking a critical artery. Initially, the anesthesiology team suspected equipment malfunction. Perhaps a faulty IV catheter or a hurried staffer had introduced air accidentally. However, the number of these events, 4 confirmed deaths by January 2018, far exceeded typical statistics, prompting the hospital to initiate a covert internal review. Investigators delved into surveillance footage, medication logs, and staffing rosters. They noticed a chilling pattern. Each air event coincided with shifts under Davis's watch. Further, colleagues recalled an unsettling detail. Davis often lingered in equipment rooms late at night, sometimes staring at unused syringes as if weighing the possibilities. When forensic analysis of IV tubing and empty hybrid syringes revealed trace amounts of residual blood consistent with purposeful air injection, the hospital alerted local law enforcement. Meanwhile, anxious staff moved swiftly to quarantine Davis. Suddenly, faith in the veteran nurse crumbled. During police interviews, Davis exhibited remarkable composure, insisting he was innocent. His attorney argued that Davis was being scapegoated for routine hospital tragedies. But witness testimony signed a different tune. One night, shift nurse described how Davis quietly eyed a freshly sedated patient, his palms flexing around a syringe before calmly plunging air into the patient's central line. When the patient thrashed in a code blue was called, Davis reportedly arrived breathless at the bedside, resolutely shouting orders and drawing admiration from colleagues who believed he had acted heroically. In February 2018, Davis was arrested and charged with 4 counts of capital murder, each count representing a life he had snuffed out with malicious precision. Prosecutors painted him as a calculating predator who preyed on patients freshly released from the operating room, vulnerable and alone, their arterial lines begging to be manipulated. Family members of the victims testified to the profound shock and grief of losing a loved one who should have lived. One widow recounted how her husband, a kind-hearted retired firefighter, had arrived at the hospital expecting to spend time with grandchildren mere days later, only to have his final moments filled with terror as his body convulsed from an injected air bubble obstructing his brainstem. At trial, forensic pathologists explained how even a small volume of air, mere milliliters, could cause catastrophic damage to the heart or brain. The jury was shown surveillance stills capturing Davis sliding a syringe into a patient's line, his face inscrutable as alarms echoed. Davis's defense team attempted to argue mental impairment, but expert witnesses countered that there was no documented history of psychosis, only Davis's twisted desire for adrenaline-fueled drama. After just 2 days of deliberations, the jury found Davis guilty on all counts. In September 2018, the judge sentenced him to death. His execution scheduled for 2025. Appeals and motions for retrial continue to reverberate through the Texas courts, but for the families of the victims, every passing day compounds their agony. Will he ever truly pay for watching life bleed out through an air bubble? Locked away in a death row cell, Davis contemplates a future where each tick of the clock may edge him closer to lethal injection, the ultimate poetic justice for a man who took joy in engineering his victims' final breaths. Families scarred by Davis's actions grapple with an indelible horror. A trusted nurse who wielded air as a weapon, twisting the sacred trust of caregiving into a perverse game of life and death.